Hey, greetings everybody. Thank you for stopping by and listening to me for what I hope is to be an ever-expanding dialogue on the topic of homelessness. I believe we can start at the premise that everyone understands that homelessness is an issue in all societies and it should be dealt with in a humane manner. So what I hope to do with this video is not only raise a little bit of awareness on how societies help people who are homeless in 3 steps, and I say this very unsarcastically as I possibly can. It's by giving them a home. I also want to add that this is just what I have gained through research, and none of it is any sort of first-hand or second-hand experience, so I just hope to sharpen my talking points and arguments on my channel as it matures over time. So first, let me tell you about a story written in the New York Times in 2006 about the story of an ex-Marine named Murray Barr who lived on the streets in Reno, and it was called $1 Million Murray. It's a great read if you have the time to look into the entire article yourself, but I'll just summarize it here. Murray could have been considered an alcoholic, which definitely doesn't help the situation. In an interview with Patrick O'Brien and Steve Johns, police officers for 15 years at that time, said that they had been running into Murray for their entire career. A few years ago, he was assigned to a treatment program in which he was under the equivalent of house arrest, and he thrived. He got a job and worked hard. But then the program ended. Once he graduated out, he had no one to report to, and he really needed that. O'Brien said, "I don't know whether it was his military background. I suspect that it was. He was a good cook. One time he accumulated savings of over $1,000, showed up for work religiously, did everything he was supposed to. They said congratulations and they put him back out on the street. He spent that $6,000 in a week or so. Often he was too intoxicated for the drunk tank at the jail, so he would get sent to the emergency room at St. Mary's or Washoe Medical Center. Marla Jones, who was a social worker in the emergency room at St. Mary's, saw him several times a week. The ambulance would bring him in. He would sober him up, and in fact they would sober him enough to go to jail. And he would then call the police to pick him up. In fact, that's how I met my husband. Marla Johns is married to Steve Johns." So the story continues with Marla and Steve worrying when Murray would not quit drinking, but Murray was known for being kind of a funny person, so they would always just check up on him. In fall of 2003, the Reno Police Department had began to limit panhandling in the downtown areas. To digress a little bit, I have mixed feelings on panhandling. I definitely believe that panhandling should be an illegal act, as individuals who partake in panhandling should be focusing their time on becoming a member of society once again. And by donating any sort of materials to the homeless person, you help feed a sort of soft addiction that they need to stay in the area in order to survive. But the other part of it is if the city doesn't have a handle on their homelessness situation, and then there's a lack of public services that are in the area, then it should definitely be allowed. It really just depends on the current situation that the city is in. And I thought, wow, I've never seen any of these critics in one of the alleyways in the middle of the winter looking for bodies. O'Brien was angry. In downtown Reno, food for the homeless was plentiful. There was a gospel kitchen, Catholic services, and even a local McDonald's that fed the hungry. The panhandling was for liquor, and the liquor was anything but harmless. He and John spent the last of half their time dealing with people like Murray. They were as much caseworkers as police officers. The article goes on into detail about what happens when people pass out in the street, and all the costs in social services it does to care for these individuals. There was a one-down call to the paramedics. There were 4 people in an ambulance, and the patient sometimes stayed at the hospital for days, because living on the streets in almost a state of constant intoxication was a reliable way of getting sick. None of that surely could be cheap. We came up with 3 names that were some of the most chronic inebriates in the downtown area that got arrested the most often, O'Brien said. We tracked down those 3 individuals through just one of our 2 hospitals. One of the guy had been in jail previously, so he had been on the streets for 6 months. In those 6 months, he had accumulated a bill of $100,000, and that was at the smaller of the 2 hospitals near downtown Reno. It was reasonable to assume that the other hospital had an even larger bill. Another individual came from Portland. He had been in Reno for 3 months, and in those 3 months, he had accumulated a bill of $65,000. The third individual actually had some periods of being sober and had accumulated a bill of $50,000. The first of those people was Murray Barr, and Johnson O'Brien realized that if he totted up all the hospital bills for 10 years, that he had been on the streets, as well as the substance abuse costs, doctor's fees, and other expenses, Murray Barr probably ran up a medical bill as large as anyone in the state of Nevada. It cost us $1 million not to do something about Murray, O'Brien said. And this is just the first part of 5 sections that the article covers. Before we jump into my 3 steps, let's just look at some of the variables on both the 2013-2016 reports from the National Alliance to End Homelessness in America. This first image is a chart of the total amount of homeless people, sheltered versus unsheltered, individuals versus people and families, and then a breakdown further of descriptions in some of the categories. It is either a decrease of 69,074 people or 11% decrease in 3 years, which isn't the best, but it's also, not bad. That's 23,000 people a year removed from homelessness. Also, 564,708 is the number from the 2016's population of around 323 million people. So that's about 0.2% of the entire population, and which is, 2 people in every 1,000 people who are homeless in America. That's not great, but it's also not that bad. So there's going to be lots of room for improvement, and we know what issues need to be addressed. This last slide I wanted to add, it's because one of the 2013 statements made me do a little bit of a double take. Overall, the chronically homeless population decreased by 7% between 2011 and 2012, 30 of the 51 states reported. 51 states reported. I didn't realize that Obama added another state between 2011 and 2012. I'm pretty sure that would have been kind of big news. And then, as I was reading through the article, they were just talking about the District of Columbia as a state. So, I caught up, don't worry. And these charts, they just show us the percentage of the change in homelessness population for each state on Nifty Graph. So, good job to Texas and Georgia. This also provides a great deal of social services that help in tandem with helping solve homelessness. To fully address the issue of homelessness and to help create a long-term stability, the Salvation Army has developed a continuum of care that ranges from early intervention, crisis accommodation, medium-term care, a range of counseling and rehabilitation services. All of these services together return people into secure long-term accommodations as part of their local community. Working in these steps to giving shelter to the homeless greatly helps society, and this is a great way to help. So that leads us to my main point, giving them a home. There are countless studies, for instance, from San Francisco to New York City that have shown that long-term style of housing assistance is less expensive than providing additional shelters and institutional care facilities. The Coalition for the Homeless had these 3 policies that New York had implemented. Federal housing assistance. Federal housing programs are one of the most successful housing-based solutions to reduce homelessness. The 2 largest federal housing programs are public housing and federal housing vouchers, known as Housing Choice Vouchers or Section 8 vouchers. Housing vouchers allow low-income households to rent modest market-rate housing of their choice and provide a flexible subsidy that adjusts with the family's income over time. Studies show that the public housing and federal housing vouchers are highly successful at reducing family homelessness and ensuring that these families remain stably housed out of the shelter system. Permanent supportive housing. Pioneered in New York City in the 1980s, permanent supportive housing now has proven to be a successful and cost-effective solution to the homeless crisis. The important housing model combines affordable housing assistance with vital supporting services for individuals living with mental illness, HIV/AIDS, or other serious health problems. Moreover, numerous research studies have shown that a permanent housing costs less than other forms of emergency and institutional care. The landmark 1990 City-State New York Agreement, which had been renewed twice, is the premier example of the permanent supportive housing initiative that successfully reduces homelessness in New York City and saves taxpayer dollars that would otherwise have been spent on costly shelters and hospitalizations. Housing first. This is actually the first policy that I was introduced to and I have the most experience with. Another proven solution developed in New York City and replicated nationwide is the housing first approach to street homelessness, which builds on the success of permanent supportive housing. The housing first approach involves moving long-term street homeless individuals, and the majority of whom are living with mental illness, substance abuse disorders, and other serious health problems, directly into subsidized housing and then linking them to the supporting services, either on-site or in the community. Research studies have found that the majority of long-term street homeless people moved into Housing First apartments, remain stably housed, and experience significant improvements in their health problems. Much like permanent supportive housing, the Housing First approach is far less costly than the emergency and institutional care, such as shelters, hospitals, and correctional facilities. To add to the Housing First narrative a bit, the old argument, if you could really call it that, used to be that homeless individuals would have to receive treatment first, and then they would find work while living in a halfway home, synonymous with homeless shelters, and then be rewarded with a home, also known as straight housing because it bans all substances. This is a method that has currently been set up in a great deal of cities and is thankfully being succeeded by the Housing First style programs. I don't think this is the correct method because even if, as we read with the $1 Million Murray story, people who receive substance abuse treatment and get the temporary stint at a new job, they would usually just end up back on the street the majority of the time and go through the whole cycle over again. The only article I could really find that argued for treatment first was on rehabs.com, and it goes into a number of important things on the author of the opinion piece on why treatment should be coming before housing. So here's an article in 2015 called Homeless Addicts Need Treatment Before Housing. This was literally the only article I could find, and it leads to an almost articleception, so let's just dive on into it. Substance abuse among the homeless population has remained a widespread problem across the country. Data released in 2003 by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration showed that 38% of the homeless Americans were alcohol dependent and another 26% abused other drugs. Advocates for this community often said that getting the homeless into adequate housing facilities should be the first step towards helping them overcome addiction. However, a new study out of Canada shows that housing is not the most important factor into helping the chronically homeless get clean. And I completely agree. A treatment facility would be a great deal better than a homeless shelter when it comes to dealing with addiction issues, but housing is still more important than people receiving treatment. So let's just look at this study. Housing First does not help addicts. So this is already a false statement, but I'm going to explain later when we take a look into this study. The finding of a Simon Fraser University study that followed almost 500 homeless people over 2 years. Julian Summers is an SFU clinical psychologist doing research aimed for helping Vancouver solve its crisis of homelessness. His research team followed 497 Vancouver residents who were homeless and mentally ill. A control group received treatment as usual, while 297 people were given independent housing with supporting services including mental health care. When Summers compared the drug habits to the two groups, the findings were surprising to him. The Housing First did not reduce any daily substance use compared to the treatment as usual after 12 or 24 months. No, Housing First really wouldn't reduce any sort of daily substance use, I would think. It's mostly because you've just moved homeless people into a situation where they're just in less poverty. But instead of being outside in poverty and drug addicted, now they're just inside. That's literally the only difference. Maple Ridge Councilman Bob Mass said that it's counterintuitive to think that if you put 50 to 60 drug-addicted people in housing that they'll just quit using drugs. There was never as much confidence that would be an answer to addictions, he said, adding that locally there has been a resistance to a Housing First approach to the homelessness. Now say it with me, everybody. Housing First does not directly impact addiction rates. They're still going to be in poverty. The Housing First link is what takes me actually to my main point, which is the purpose of Housing First. Housing First is an effective tool in solving chronic and episodic homelessness while reducing pressure on other emergency services. This is the purpose of Housing First. It reduces pressure on police and emergency services from having to be a part of social services. Permanent housing, complemented by the provision of services, helps to assist clients sustain their housing and work towards recovery and reintegration to the community. Housing First then helps addicts by giving them the opportunity to not have to focus on finding their housing or shelter, and then they can just focus on whatever else they deem appropriate. I would like to add that in the case studies listed in their link, it's a great source on why Housing First is a great method to relieve various social systems. So now back to the original article. In some cases, those who are homeless simply decline to take advantage of shelters or other similar opportunities in their community. There isn't always a lot of storage. People can't keep their pets with them. A male and female couple can't stay together, said Bivon Dufty, director of the Mayor's Office of Housing Opportunity Partnership and Engagement in San Francisco. This is actually a major problem with the shelter system right now. I mean, just look at this image. Shelters normally look like something you would see in a barracks. Their main purpose is to identify how many people can stay in an area and give them a place to sleep. They don't really get any space for storage, which usually, I would think having storage lockers seems like a good idea, but I mean, really, that's just speculation on my part. But these are definitely faults in a shelter. But in order for homeless people to get well, they need a place to go. It's important for communities across the country to provide them with resources, including access to methadone detox facilities. No one said that they didn't need them. It's just that having access to detox facilities doesn't cleanse them of their poverty. Once they complete these avenues, opportunities for permanent housing and employment can be more easily taken advantage of. There are plenty of homeless individuals who are ready to help themselves. They simply just don't have access to the necessary avenues. The sad truth of it all is that yes, subsidized housing and short-term solutions such as shelters do not help them get clean. But one of the purposes, they're supposed to put a roof over their head and eventually give them a place to eat. But when people are in need, long-term solutions are in really short supply, and you have to do something to provide for people in need, even if it does exacerbate poverty. So we need both short and long-term solutions to solve the issue that is homelessness. The last thing I want to talk about here is how to address the problems in that the article brought up. And one I think that America's Habitat for Humanity is a fantastic program for what can be an example of a long-term solution. And Habitat actually puts in place what they call sweat equity. Sweat equity creates jobs by allowing skilled and unskilled workers alike to come together and build homes for Habitat for Humanity's wait list, and creates a jobs program that low-income families can essentially pay with labor in order to construct not only their own home later in life, but also homes for people who need them as well. Here's a good summary from their website about sweat equity. Sweat equity can take many forms. For partner families working with Habitat, it can mean construction work on their home or on a home for another family, cleaning up the build site, working on a Habitat restore, assisting in administrative duties, or countless other things of helping out. Children sometimes also can contribute to the family sweat equity through things like earning good grades in school. The local Habitat in Jackson County, Florida awards 1 hour of sweat equity for every A the child earns. Homeowner classes, learning how to manage a home or finances, also count as sweat equity. Families invest their time in a long-term success to their home ownership. Throughout the process of purchasing their home, Habitat partner families can earn sweat equity as they learn about mortgage, insurance, maintenance, safety, and more. So this is what I think giving people a personal stake into earning their homes, as well as creating jobs for people, is definitely a great way to approach this as a long-term solution. I would think that short-term, or like the problems that Habitat for Humanity would face would just be like everyone else. It would just be they need to source their money from somewhere, and then they need to find land, or at least the homes, in order to redo these restore projects. Hey everybody, I'm just through editing right now. I just wanted to thank you all for stopping by to watch this. I'm really hoping that every month I can just put up on this channel probably just something that is really good about homelessness that's been going in the country, and hopefully do like a this month in homelessness kind of thing. So to add a little bit of positivity to everybody. Otherwise, thank you for sticking by and subscribe to the channel. And I'm hoping to do just a whole bunch of weird stuff also other than homelessness. So thank you. Bye. This is also a great deal of social services that help in tandem of helping solve the homelessness problem. Oh my God.